So
Yeah.
are any of these laws of power like, honest, or are they all kind of
Yes.
types of manipulation?
No. I'd say more than half are honest, and more than half are kind of common sense and relatively positive. So interaction with boldness is not an evil law. It means when you start something, if you show that you were bold and decisive, people are attracted to that. I talk about play a perfect courtier. The world that we live in, every kind of time there's a power structure, it's like a court surrounding a king. And you have to be charming, and you have to be polite, and you have to be gracious in this court. So there's nothing kind of, I mean, you might find that a little devious, but it's mostly about being polite and understanding other people and kind of understanding the culture that you're in. There's a law called work on the hearts and minds of others, which means that you can't force people into things. You have to get them to want what you want to do as opposed to pushing them in certain directions. Despise the free lunch, which is all about the power of generosity. You don't want to like always be looking for things on the cheap. You don't want to accept things that are free. You want to pay for things, and you want to be generous with your time and your money and your energy. I mean, I could go on and on. There's a core, maybe a third, that are kind of a little bit hardcore and a little bit, well, definitely manipulative, but it's not the majority of laws.
Which ones are your favorite?
Well, law number one, I have a kind of a personal relationship for several reasons. It's called never outshine the master. And the idea is that if you enter the work world and you try so hard to please and impress the boss, which is a very common thing that we do, they might end up feeling that you think that they're better than they are. You might inadvertently outshine them and make them feel insecure. And once you do that, they're never going to tell you that that's what you've done. They're going to fire you, and you'll never really understand why. And it's very painful. And I've had that happen to me. I could think at least three times I can recall. One very, the most emotional one of all, where I was hired on a television show to do the research and find the stories. And by far, I was the most successful researcher there. But I was making too many people above me feeling insecure, like they weren't getting credit for things. And they started making my life miserable, and then they fired me. And I couldn't figure out why. Like I had the best record of all. Why would you fire someone like that? Well, ego matters more than results in a lot of places that in a lot of work worlds. And so and the reason I like that story so much is I had heard somebody told me a story before all this had happened about Louis XIV, the great French king of the 17th century, and how he had a finance minister named Nicolas Fouquet, who threw the most lavish party in honor of Louis, the king, so that he could ingratiate himself into the king's favor and maybe be nominated as prime minister. And the party was so memorable. People wrote about it years later. It had fireworks, it had plays. I visited the chateau where it happened. It was just probably the most magnificent party ever thrown in the history of mankind. And everyone was like telling Nicholas, this is wonderful. Well, the next day he was thrown in prison, and he spent the rest of his life in prison. He had outshone the king. And I remember that story years later when it happened to me. And I go, there's something true there. There's something elemental about human psychology. And years later, when I was first pitched the idea to the man who produced the 48 Laws of Power, I started with that story. And I told him, this happened 500 years ago when people were wearing powdered wigs and all these
Mhm.
elaborate costumes. But the world hasn't changed. It's the same dynamic no matter where you are. So that personally is kind of maybe one of my favorite laws. And there are others, but that stands out.
That sounds extremely frustrating. It sounds like you
Yeah.
wouldn't want your company to grow really if your ego is above good work.
But isn't that pretty common? Haven't you encountered that as well? I mean, everybody,
Yeah. Yeah,
I
but
mean, um, the thing that people make a mistake about, I don't know if you agree with me here, but is that you think that the person above you, your boss, he or she seems so powerful and in control, you don't realize that they have insecurities, that they have an ego, that they have weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And you assume that if you say something that might be a little bit ambiguous, they'll laugh it off because they're so powerful. They don't care about me or what I say. But the truth is, the higher up you go in a hierarchy, the more insecure you become. The more you're worried about whether people really, truly respect you, whether people really are truly admiring you, whether you have their attention or not. And so powerful people often have more insecurities than those on the bottom of the scale. And you go into the work world not thinking of the egos of powerful people, but it's very evident and it can cause you a lot of problems.
Okay, that makes sense. And that might be because people at the top have more to lose, potentially. That could play into it, maybe.
Very much so. That's very true.